Baldo, the Guardian Owls. A game made for fans of top-down action adventures that got crushed a bit more than necessary by reviewers upon its release that I now can't help but feel compelled to make a video review and startup guide for others who may be curious about this underrated indie gem, especially with other brutal adventure games like Elden Ring and Zelda-inspired puzzlers like Tunic in the mainstream spotlight right now. Baldo's cel-shaded, Ghibli-inspired art style is an instant eye-catcher and is charming throughout the entire game. While aspects are strikingly familiar, don't let its cute aesthetic fool you, it is hard. This game starts with our young hero Baldo and his friend Luna in their hometown when she wakes to let you know your grandfather's looking for you. This gentle-looking old man apparently has been somewhat of an adventurer or historian in his past, spending his life seeking a place called the Lost Galleon. An old abandoned ship long thought disappeared with the treasure inside said to be the weapon against ultimate evil. This tale sounds even more familiar, if not a little too familiar, with another legendary franchise as he continues to explain if one pure of heart is born, one with no heart would be born too, and only to be vanquished by one brave of heart. And look, I'm a sap for this stuff and I'm gonna take it. And Zelda surely wasn't the first to do these sort of things, it just became a prime example, right? So off you go to seek a nearby owl tower, along the way picking up quests. Blue quests are your main quests, and green quests are your side quests. It's worth noting some side quests, when completed, will make way to other more worthwhile quests. Once you've accomplished a few and follow a chicken into an owl tower, you fall through the floor into a catacomb, closely followed by Luna, where you discover the owl horn, and you meet Enor, the owl. He is from the fabled Owl Village, and is your most frequent assistant on your journey, and he teaches you the owl song. This song is to Baldo what Zelda's lullaby was to Ocarina of Time. You play it to activate warp points, traps, secrets, and more. Sometimes you can use it to activate an overworld warp point for quick travel. Other times, you play it to activate a secret, such as a new passage inside of a dungeon. You're gonna use this song a lot. Like, a lot. But anyway, you have the horn, you know the main song, and it's back to starting your adventure. Luna suggests you find the Owl Village and seek out help at Rodea Town, which she knows a secret passage to, and that's necessary because apparently soldiers maintain guard at entry points on most town edges, as authoritarian and scary as that may sound. But she says first, we should go explore the abandoned mine shaft our grandfather told us about where the Lost Galleon might be. So off we go. Spoilers, check your main quests here because you do need a shovel before entering the galleon. Yes, your first item, other than the musical horn, is a shovel. And also, be sure to seek out the Map Man in various locations throughout Rodea because he is how you complete your overworld map. Your first dungeon is in fact the Lost Galleon, and it sort of works as a tutorial, and a unique one at that. As I mentioned earlier, your first major item found, other than the musical owl horn, is the shovel, not a sword like most top-down action-adventure titles. The first dungeon's item to acquire is in fact that sword, so until you acquire it near the end of the dungeon, you must find ways to defeat your enemies using objects found in the same room as them, making for a one-of-a-kind experience within this game while simultaneously being your tutorial stage. And that's pretty cool. It's littered with plenty of decently challenging secrets, and though it's one of the shorter dungeons in the game, it still takes a good while to overcome. Even my second playthrough, where I knew what to do, took a bit of time. And once you've got that stored, your base gear set is established, and it has a satisfying feeling. Though Baldo is not the first to do this, it still is refreshing to have a game where it does not hand you your main weapon. There is no "it's dangerous to go alone, take this" moment, and the game makes you work for it. And once you've got it, it just feels right, and it's satisfying. And like any dungeon crawling adventures, somewhere inside this dungeon there is a boss key. And in the world of Baldo, it's the triangle owl key. Practically every dungeon has one, and it's your ticket to whatever boss encounter the dungeon has in store for you, but more on dungeons later. Here, once the Galleon's boss is vanquished and Enor trusts you with the half of a key to the fabled Owl Village, the world begins to open up. Just half a key? Yes, the other half you can find somewhere else. Take note of where he last heard of it being. And in fact, while I'm not one for taking notes in games much, this game really can kind of use it, just like back in those days with the original Legend of Zelda and the map and the manual. And in these days, though, you can take screenshots, whether it be of specific areas that have special landmarks you need to remember, maybe statues that seem to be facing strange directions, or just keeping track of dialogue to look back and reflect on for guidance later. Now, with the Galleon done and sword in hand, the game really begins. There are new places to visit and new characters to meet, most with new quests to be completed. New locales are mentioned to you by strangers that are worth noting and eventually seeking out. There are markets to visit with food to buy that will protect you in harsh colds or intense heat, and other shops that offer outfits that produce these same possibilities and more, such as marking wildlife on your map for easier hunting. There's even occasionally following companion characters who help you if you help them. But wait, there's more! Other than continuing to follow your main quest, which typically involves saving Luna from some terrible plight, there are also owl towers to find. And, as well as that, owl statue chambers, which contain runes of power. The runes of power that you can find inside owl chambers can be traded into only one owl at one location in the game, which he then transfers into additional hearts of energy for you. Now, these owl towers, however, contain runes, and when matching runes are combined, they can activate other magical weapons and items scattered around the world. These owl towers and owl chambers can be found and completed at almost any point after mastering the Galleon. Your exploration will be rewarded, but it will not be easy. As you progress further onwards towards and through Rodea Town and past your next mini-dungeon, the world continually opens up to you more and more. A tremendous amount of it can be explored almost right away, before even heading off to the next major dungeon, but it is not designed in your favor. Much of the overworld, like its dungeons, is labyrinthian. You need to find the right paths around the overworld to reach the exits you desire. It certainly can open up in parts of the plains and also in the desert, but getting to far off points on your map often requires taking the same path to get there each time you wish to return. This game is built to make you explore, interrogate, and memorize its landscape. If you seek and overcome enough of it, you can find more warp points and owl towers, making future exploration more convenient over time. And how? Well, because of this lovely fellow, of course. He teaches you the rest of your melodies in the game, even if there are a few left to learn in the first place. One of which allows you to warp to any point you've activated in the overworld, regardless of whether or not you've discovered the map for that region. The other song allows you to save screenshots directly to the memories portion of your in-game pause menu. This allows for quicker access to important places you want to remember, just in case you might need to revisit them later, or perhaps they might be an overworld clue to other locations' puzzles. And yes, I cannot stress enough that some dungeons and even some owl towers have puzzles whose clues are found elsewhere in the game, not always nearby that puzzle they are meant for. Take screenshots, take notes, study everything. Now, while this may seem daunting and is definitely why reviewers criticize the game for having puzzles too complex or convoluted, there is a surprisingly helpful location found deep in Rodea Town. Its library. It's clear the developers were aware they were making a tough game, and its design infers they did so purposefully, but this library they provided in the game's world has books filled with hints to almost every difficult puzzle the game has to offer. Each book has its own price, and once purchased, you have access to its contents in your menu at any time on the tips page. Though it can feel tedious to have to travel back to the library and find a book that might help you when stuck in a particularly puzzling spot, the fact that it exists at all is brilliant and wildly helpful without giving you that guilty sense that you're cheating by looking up the answers. Honestly, this library should keep you from having to give in and look online for help. overworld's labyrinthian design is enforced by dangers from enemies both visible and invisible, as the physics take even the smallest of cliffs seriously. If Baldo falls down a ledge that's about his height or taller, it's an instant blackout and removal of 1 heart, but thankfully also a quick respawn above where you fell. That is unless you only have 1 heart left, in which case you respawn back at the last exit or entrance you came through, and all progress between that entrance and your death is lost. If you've explored a lot in one area without passing through a door or a loading screen, it's best to up those hearts, whether that's by eating food or drinking red potions. Enemy variety in Baldo is also pretty solid. The further you explore, the more dangers you will discover. What helps further is, just like other games in the same vein as Baldo, some enemies have variations that reside in specific climates around the land. Some larger monsters thrive hidden away in specific locations ready to ambush you when you least expect it. And all of them have specific attack patterns. Each enemy comes with a learning curve as you study its assaults and defenses. Be prepared to die a lot. Sometimes the combat can come off a bit clunky with missed jabs and strange hitboxes, but it rarely feels unfair. By the end of the game, there weren't any enemies that still made me quiver upon approaching them. Except maybe those laser eye tower things. All this exploring, discovery, and enemy bullying is great, even with its occasional frustrations, but the more substantial weight of the game is carried by its dungeons. For those who love challenging puzzles and those early dungeons from the 2D days of Zelda, or even modern world open RPG dungeons we have in AAA games now, y'all will find a satisfying challenge in Baldo's dungeons. Rarely will you find anything spelled out for you in these lengthy treks. Puzzle solutions require analyzing every room for unique landmarks or furniture that might stand out as a clue, sometimes interacting with enemies in the room that can destroy other furniture to help you get through a passage, or maybe switches that require something weighing them down to allow access through a secret room. One dungeon is an old prison crawling with agile skeletons, filled with backtracking and mazes of spider-webbed walls. Another was an abandoned royal mansion with magical mirrors that lead to dizzying, booby-trapped hallways. And another was volcanic furnace deep in the mountaintops, filled with adjustable lava and multiple floors of secrets to uncover. Sometimes you'd take out a room of enemies and trigger a switch or chest needed to complete the dungeon. But other times you'd defeat all the enemies in a room or maybe solve a puzzle just to be rewarded with 10 coins of currency. And while that does add up and money becomes quite useful during late game quests, in the moment it can be quite unsatisfying, especially if the challenge was time consuming. Often, if a challenge proved to be too much or I got stuck on a puzzle I swore I couldn't find an answer to, taking a break and returning later with a fresh head helped me reassess the dungeon that stumped me. This is also good advice in general because some of these dungeons can take hours to overcome. And most of the bosses in these dungeons were pretty clever too, offering some good personality and unique battle strategies. What was disappointing is a few of the bosses proved to be underwhelming since a couple of them were repeat bosses for the sake of the ongoing plot, but it didn't drag the experience down enough to stop me from continuing onward. Just as the Galleon had the sword hidden away to gain, 3 of the other main dungeons have magical items hidden in them too, which are needed to progress through your quests and future dungeons, and maybe an owl tower or 2 as well. With these 3 items and your owl horn shovel and sword as well, you can complete the main game in its entirety. But there are 12 magical items total. That leaves 6 optional magical weapons scattered across the world to discover and wield. As I mentioned earlier, these devices are only obtainable once you've acquired all the runes needed to awaken the power of each of them, and these runes are only found within owl towers. Then you'll have to locate the items themselves around the land before turning in the runes to activate their abilities. And this is where the overall game design becomes prominently questionable. As awesome as it is for the completionist to have these optional quests, they have little impact on assisting your adventure. Some of the weapons have greater range than your main arsenal, but some aren't nearly as strong as your trusty, more convenient sword, or as easy to properly use without wasting ammunition. And this becomes problematic quickly because all of these items are powered by the white orbs you find throughout the game. So while you'll spend the front half of your adventure barely worrying about orbs and hoarding a hefty amount, you'll find yourself burning through them quickly in the back half, especially if you use a lot of these weapons. It would have been much more satisfying had the final dungeon or final boss even required the use of some of these items in one way or another. However, it is worth noting that some of these weapons have such a wide range that they can affect switches to puzzles you may not have otherwise been able to reach so soon. Despite how much critics made me nervous to play it, I thoroughly enjoyed my 50 or so hours with this game, the back half of which especially found me barely being able to put my Switch down. As someone who favored Breath of the Wild because of the exploration and shrine discoveries, Baldo certainly scratched that itch with its world and owl towers, and its dungeons were, for the most part, intriguing and satisfying, even when they were an absolute pain and, The developer's attempt to make a Zelda game that didn't hold your hand definitely hit the nail pretty square on the head. Its menu screens definitely could have used some extra work to be more user-friendly, I must say. Though its ending rushes by, leaving quite a bit to be desired, and its overall quest design arguably doesn't carry enough motivation for the player to explore beyond the main story, I can't help but recommend this to anyone who has ever enjoyed a 2D Zelda game or really any brutal open-world action-adventure. This successfully takes that top-down action-adventure formula, opens things up with a twist on visual design, and offers little mercy from its dangers and puzzles, leaving any who do complete it with a feeling of satisfaction having toppled this beast. Now, do I think this game is some modern masterpiece? Not really. Is it the peak of indie Zelda-likes? Probably not that either, especially when more faithful Zelda clones like Blossom Tales carry more familiar resemblance, or popular action-adventure dungeon crawlers like Death's Door and Tunic are sweeping the scene, and perhaps even arguably better in polished quality. But I do think this game at release got some unfair perspectives and reviews slapped on it, causing it to heavily fly under everyone's radar. It wasn't and isn't perfect, and thankfully has been patched since it dropped, meaning my experience was already set to be better than those reviewing at launch, as is yours. Yet masterful games that carry heavy flaws but are promoted by major AAA companies and supported by franchise familiarity often get more leniency in the review process than other indie games do. And that's not to say that those major games don't deserve the high review scores they get, just that I wish reviewers and even the public in general was more generous with their willingness to give indie games a fighting chance, even though they may be foreign to a consumer than a franchise or developer they've already had experience with. Leave your bias behind and enter these games with an open mind, and maybe some added patience. If you can handle the struggles and torments of a Souls-like, or the challenges of a labyrinthian Metroidvania, or overcome the backtracking tribulations of any 2D Zelda game, you can most certainly handle the unforgiving brutality of Baldos, mazes, and monsters. Do you have what it takes to save Luna from the mysterious Dark Sorcerer?